Hi.
Hi. Welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 1, Episode 14. And today we are joined by Bee Scerri to talk about world building outside the box. As our regular viewers know, Inside the Rookery series takes you backstage into the world of games design and is supported by our generous patrons. We also have a lively Discord community, which you can join in the link popping up on the screen. And this is where you can pre-submit your questions for our live streams. I will scoop them up, or one of us will, and pop them in the chat, and we will get to them through the course of the discussion. And of course, if you have any questions that you would like to ask or comments you'd like to make as we go through the discussion, then pop them into the chat and I'll bring them up on screen. So, Bee, it's over to you for a little introduction before we get started on the pre-submitted questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Bee or Ben Scerri, either is fine. I am a Maltese Australian game designer. I have been doing this for, I think, about 9 years now, in total, like professionally, but a lot longer than that beforehand. I have worked in video games and live action and tabletop games, most recently professionally with Cubicle 7 on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. My pronouns are they, them, and I think that's about everything, like introduction-wise.
Brilliant, thank you. Seagull says they're loving the rainbow throw on the bed behind Bee.
Thank you. My mother actually crocheted it during the lockdown.
Seagull, you're not going to get one then.
Sorry. I can let her know, though.
Just before we start, does everyone like my festive jumper? Sorry.
Excellent, yeah.
Better than my ding dong.
Just telling me about that before we started. So let's get into it. So Kilishandra has pre-submitted a question. What do you think lies outside the box, and what can we do to bring them inside the box?
Great question. So outside the box is sort of a loose term, but I would say it's anything that is the opposite of what's inside the box. And inside the box is, what you kind of expect, I suppose. So for my money, that would be anything based in like a Eurocentric, heteronormative, very, like classic feudalism, Middle Ages style setting, at least when we're talking about fantasy. And then fantasy again would be your sort of more typical, like expected dark fantasy, high fantasy, anything that you could sort of sink your teeth into and immediately taste that, like D&D, post Lord of the Rings, even Warhammer, like DNA. And if you could take that bite and say it would firmly fit into any of those settings without any jostling, that's inside the box, I would say. Do you folks want to like give your definition, and then we can like jostle around about how we could maybe bring those things in?
Want to go, Graham?
Sure. Yeah. My reaction to what B just said was basically it's anything you can stick a label on, and seems to be the case. And the usual fantasy, of course, was informed by Arthurian romances, Hollywood movies of the 30s through the 50s. Not exactly the most inclusive of media.
Really?
What do you think, Andy? Anything to add, or shall we move on?
I mean, when I wrote up my brief little intro, I added a little bit that said something along the lines that it's just another retelling of our classic Western fables from J.R.R. Martin or J.R.R. Tolkien, or what did I say? Or we are our unoriginal. Yet another example of the same fantasy tropes being repeated and regurgitated in different ways, and often by taking somebody else's culture and just repeating the same stories, but with slightly different labels attached to them, without any real awareness of what they're doing. And that, for me, is the inside the box area. And outside the box it's everything that B suggested. And I would, to an extent, extend it even further in a host of other directions. It's everything that you don't expect. And Bee sort of said that, but I would push it further and say almost everything. And it's something that we found when we're building our stuff to be a constant challenge, because we're building something that can do exactly what Bee said, slot into everybody's fantasy, while simultaneously being something that is unique, stands on its own 2 feet, sits on the outside as well. And that has been, I think, an extraordinary challenge and a fun one.
And
for us to tackle.
it's often about subverting expectations. So it's, and we'll come on to this later, what can you do about this, but for me it's about always examining your first thought, and is that first thought based on your own biases, your own background, and what could you do to subvert that first thought to be something different, to think about it from another person's perspective. And when you don't have that perspective, trying to go out there and find that perspective. So, you know, the Rookery, we acknowledge, is a very white organization, but wherever possible, we want to have playtesters, we want to have people in our community, we want to reach out to people who don't look like us and sound like us and think like us and say, what do you think of our stuff? Does it seem like you're excluded from this? Because another way of looking for me at inside the box and outside the box is a discussion that I had with Andy many years ago about what I wanted from a fantasy game. And I didn't want to go into a fantasy game and have all the limitations that are placed on me in the real world repeated for any character I choose to play in a fantasy game. So for me, inside the box is setting expectations and constraints on people that replicate real world constraints for no reason other than you just haven't thought, and why it could be different and how it could be different. How you can step outside the box. So here's what, and that leads nicely.
The second part.
Oh, sorry.
There's the second part of that question as well, which is what can we do to bring them in?
Yeah, and I think, like Lindsay, you did touch on that a lot, like examining your choices and examining your thought processes going in. Specifically, I had a teacher a long time ago now, sadly, who suggested, like, your first thought, and I believe I actually wrote this into one of the Warhammer blogs, your first thought, just get rid of it, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it is a general good rule to follow, that your first thought is going to be the obvious one, the boring one, likely the misinformed, you know, unintentionally bigoted one. So, and that is true of everyone, regardless of how, you know, how beyond the hegemony your intersections lie. But yeah, just being really conscious of what you're doing, and not just of what you know, but very specifically what you don't know. So going into something and saying, like, am I placing a morality on this setting that's based on Catholicism? Should it be based on Catholicism? Is it possible that there are completely different moralities? And going as deep as, like, is it inherently bad to commit cannibalism? You know, like, that may seem like a very, of course it is, of course it's bad. But then you go, well, you know, what about it is bad? Why do we think it's bad? Especially because in Catholicism, it is a part of the dogma to commit cannibalism. So we've got some accepted cannibalism in the, you know, partaking of Jesus Christ's body, but the rest isn't. Why is that the case? We shouldn't put that into a game unless that game has Catholicism. Yeah,
that's really interesting, and actually really timely, because on the Discord server today we've been talking about the nature of evil, and one of the things I loved about working on WIFRIP with all three people on the stream today is that we were allowed to think about different subverting those expectations. And I was talking about Norskin, and are the Norskins evil because they worship chaos, or are they forced to worship chaos because of where they live, and they've had to make those you know, sort of changes in their lifestyle when they were pushed out by the expansionist Sigmarites 2,000 years ago? And I find that fascinating because I like to think about, and I had a character who liked to think about this, well, what if the Beastman actually could be converted to Taoism? What if? Because I don't want it to be just everyone is evil who comes from this part of the world. Well, yeah, but why? They still have families, they still have relationships, they still have love. So, and Andy, I think the three of us would agree, as the producer, gave us the permission to explore those things. And we want to keep on exploring them.
Yay.
There's some comments in the chat. Catholicism and cannibalism. Oh, that's us. We've made that comment. We've hit the ground running. Go hard or go home.
Sorry about that, folks.
Pretty much everyone watching this hopefully knows that subconscious bias affects everyone. Has anyone here got any pointers for mental exercises or writing tips to help one interrupt those thought process? We can maybe come back to that question after we've jumped to the next.
Can I have a small answer on just the last one as well? Because there's a couple of points that weren't discussed that are worth mentioning. One of the things that we can do to help bring things that are outside the box inside the box is to hire people like Bee. And bluntly, and I'm sure that's going to go down well with them. But seriously, it's reaching out and realizing that those of us that are in a privileged position where we can hire other people shouldn't immediately go out and pick up the people that we know and we understand because they are us. On a different face in a different fashion. We can help lift up other people and ensure that not only are their voices heard, which will be voices that may be different to yours, but that they can be in a position where they can challenge. And that's super important because we are filled with unconscious biases that we just don't realize are there. And the more we realize that, the better. And having somebody there just go, that thing that you've said, that's freaking unacceptable. And you go, oh, yeah, good point. Really glad you said that. But when you're in an echo chamber, nobody ever says that.
Right.
And you all produce the same and similar material. And that ultimately leads to a weaker product in every single instance. And as one last comment on that, I would add that not only do you need to do that part, you also need to ensure that you get yourself some very broad-based sensitivity readers to ensure that as much extra opinion is brought into your text as possible.
In short, build a bigger box.
I
like
that.
And
snappy.
You're the best.
So Creative Fossey asks, I find it very hard to add new elements to a world already built because the players already know how the world settings work, etc. So if I try to build in some new elements, some of the players are skeptical because that's not how this world works. So then I have to spend too much time working out the core logic behind my new elements, etc. How do you solve it or work it out?
Oh, I want this one.
Go on then, Graham.
This is one of my favorite things to do, is to set the player characters up and the players themselves so that they think they know how the world works. And it is how the world works in general. But then you hit them with the exceptions and the reasons behind the exceptions. And there's just so much story potential in that. You know, the unexpected, you know, how people have lived on the margins through all of history, for example. They have, you know, no matter how Hollywood or 19th century history school books present medieval Europe, there was always, you know, people on the margins, people doing the best they can to be themselves within this context. And if you're going to have a three-dimensional fantasy world or game world, rather than a two-dimensional one, you've got to include this. And this is like a golden opportunity. Every time you see something that's definite, or you see a player taking something for granted or saying, that's not how the world works, that's your opportunity to deepen the world and broaden their perceptions.
And Roderick said, in response to Creative Fossey, I'd suggest reading Stealing Cthulhu by Graham Walmsley. It's a stunning example of how to overcome that in Call of Cthulhu.
Totally is, agreed.
And Seagoat is happy for people to call them out for something which may be insensitive to others. Helps me grow as a GM and as a person.
Absolutely.
And just one important point on that, if you are called out, it's really, really easy to be defensive and to justify your position from your perspective. And sometimes it's okay to just say, look, I don't quite understand that, but I understand what you're saying to me, that it's hurtful to you, and I'll stop it. I think lots of role players, we maybe over intellectualize things. So we want to understand it before we do it. Sometimes you're not going to be able to understand the perspective, but you can respect the perspective.
Especially from a sensitivity reader. Like,
absolutely.
People tend to view sensitivity readers from a very defensive point of view, but you have to remember that they're an editor. Like, when I do sensitivity work, I'm coming in as an editor. It's my job to tell you the truth, and also not to be aggressive in telling you that truth, because I won't be doing my job if I can't convince you to make your story better. And, you know, that won't come about by shaming you. So don't go in feeling like you should be ashamed if something gets dug up.
Right. Yeah, it's important, as in all editing matters, to separate your work from yourself.
Absolutely.
And not to feel attacked by a criticism of your work, but you know, take it as an opportunity to learn and understand.
But on the like root second question, I've sort of got two responses to that. Lindsay, could we the one about
to bring it back up again?
Yeah,
I didn't
like
want
adding,
to hide your faces.
it's quite big.
It's quite big.
Yeah, so the two things that I would say is first of all, sort of going off the back of Graham's point, you can always take setting information as being in setting. So Wolfrip is a great example of this. The world map of the Warhammer world has always looked differently. Andy can talk at length about this because I've had that conversation at length with Andy.
We have.
But if you view that from a point of view of in-setting cartographers, you can say immediately, oh, of course they've all been different, because no map of the Earth has ever been accurate. Like, you just can't do that. You can't draw an accurate, properly 2D map of a globe. In addition to that, you know, we're dealing with a pre-industrial society, so they haven't mapped it all. They don't know the full extent of the world. So of course it looks weird. Of course it doesn't really work, because they're going off incomplete information. Same thing can go for, you know, how magic works in the setting. If your setting says that magic is about combining X and Y together, and then you bring in a third element, and your players say, you know, that's not how magic works, you can say, well, evidently the wizards who wrote the magic books were wrong. You know, humans have been wrong about so many things.
Yeah.
So, you know, why can't they have been wrong about literal magic? The other point is that when you play a game, and when you're playing in a published setting, you're not actually playing in like a set in stone carved, you know, indelible thing. You are playing in an instance of that is unique to your group.
Exactly.
So again, sorry to fall back on Warhammer, but it is a common touchstone for all of us. I have been running Wolfrip for probably like 16, 17 years now. And I would say that I've probably only run canonical Warhammer as world written maybe 10 times, and those 10 times were all whilst doing it as part of Cubicle 7, because I was representing the company. At home, I'm running my Warhammer world. I'm running the world that we all build together at the table. And, you know, it's going to be wrong, but it's wrong in the way that we want it to be. So screw it.
Yeah, wait till you hear about Andy Law's 40K with his
50-50.
Oh no, it's not even 50-50, with a gender diverse Primarch list, put it that way.
Yeah, well, and I can't agree with B more, actually. One of the best ways of dealing with people that don't let's say, subscribe to a different version to how they see the world when they sit at the table, is to just bring subjectivity and ensure that they all understand that it is a subjective view. Lawrence Sheck was discussing this a little bit regarding Elder Scrolls when he was on, what was it, a couple of weeks ago now, showing how everything in Elder Scrolls was subjective. There wasn't a single objective fact. Nobody knew the truth. And they wrote that, hard-coded that into the setting from the beginning. And it has continued all the way through. Nobody says this is the objective truth. They all say, this is what I saw. This is what I encountered. I believe this. I believe that. They're wrong. I'm right. And then you go to someone else and they say they're wrong and I'm right. And I think hard coding that into your setting can do nothing but good. It also means that if you make a mistake, you can change it, which is great.
Good wiggle room.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Everyone loves a bit of wiggle room. Another way of dealing with it is to bring all of your players on side and discuss something that you want to change. If it is something that's deep and fundamental and important to that world, if it just doesn't work for you and you'd like to make a change, sit down with everyone and say, hey, this is what I want to do. There's nothing wrong with chatting it all out. And lastly, yes, surprising your players with things like, oh my goodness, we've investigated the Primarchs from 10,000 years ago, and it turns out that it was all propaganda, and at least 3/4 of them weren't male. What the flying is a good thing.
Yeah.
Because it brings excitement to your books. Your games. It makes your games yours. And as we've said 1,000 times, and as B just said there, everybody plays at their table their own version of the game, and anything that comes printed is immediately discarded if you don't like it anyway. So don't be so fixated on those last little words. Enjoy yourselves and be creative.
Absolutely.
Here we go. We've been waiting for this one. Killer asks, I find most fantasy games to be unconsciously racist, entrenchedly imperialist, openly homophobic, and maddeningly sexist. Does this match your views? If it does, what have you done or do you intend to do to tackle this? And how can you build a world where these things can exist but are not the baseline? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, big question. Does it match my views? It does match my view that most fantasy games are unconsciously racist, etc. But I would also say that everything is, and you know, because of those unconscious biases, and we do live in a very unequal world, which currently has a few different very strong hegemonies who are hell-bent on that inequality being the way that it is. So, you know, of course, most fantasy games are, but I would not say that that's particularly the fault of fantasy, or even the fault of the fantasy authors. I think that unless you become aware of those things and then choose to consciously perpetuate them, then, you know, you're no more at fault of repeating those same problems from society than, you know, you would be in any part of your life. So, and like, what can we do to tackle those things? We've sort of touched on it. You know, remain conscious of it, seek out sensitivity readers, really broaden your perspectives, try and learn as much as possible just about random things. Being really curious is a very good thing. At the risk of falling back on the hegemony, watching quiz shows and stuff like that, like UK TV is famous for having extremely good panel and quiz shows. Watching those things and just taking notes of the things that surprise you, and then going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, you know, like you'll find things that you never knew about before, and just having that openness will help.
Yeah, and I just want to draw in the phrase maddeningly sexist, because Aster has said in the chat, I don't think I agree with that one. Fantasy is fantasy. But for me, the reason that fantasy worlds can be, frustratingly and maddeningly sexist is exactly because they're fantasy worlds. They have divine entities that are all genders. They have magic, and yet too often they're presented as a replica of Western Europe Catholicism in the 15th century, with all of the biases that brought. And that's why it's frustrating when fantasy isn't bigger than that and better than that for me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's been this perception that something isn't properly fantasy unless it's based on medieval Europe. And there's plenty of the medieval level of technology and magic working and stuff, that's fine, but it's been this perception that you have to make it properly medieval. And the trouble is, properly medieval in that definition isn't accurately how the Middle Ages were in Europe, as bad as they were in themselves, but it's this sort of black and white distillation of what medieval society was about, how repressive it was, how intolerant it was, how sexist, racist, imperialist it was. And the more you read about actual medieval history, the more you find that that wasn't the case in all places, at all times, in all instances. But this, throw out this idea that you've got to be proper fantasy, you've got to be based on this perception of medieval Europe, because that's a ball and chain that's going to prevent you from really doing anything good.
Yeah, I'd add it's also.
Sorry, Andy.
I'd add it's also a ball and chain that's largely come from the Victorian era as well, when it was very important. All of these snapsies, we're going to say the same thing. When all of these extraordinarily, let's just sum it up as awful views, were required to continue their imperialistic drive across the world.
And were retrofitted into history.
Absolutely. In many respects, racism as we understand it today just didn't exist in a variety of forms at all in the past, in the way that we understand it today. And the more you read, and the more you do exactly as B suggests, which is go down those little rabbit holes and learn what things were like rather than what we're told they were like, you start realizing that so many of your entrenched views are just wrong. And to repeat what Lindsay said over there, it's a frustration, always a frustration of mine, when you get a setting that has real gods, actual real gods. These aren't made up fantasy bits of nonsense, but actual real gods that have mixed genders or mixed races, mixed everything, yet everybody still goes, oh well, the men are in control, especially the white ones. Why
are there even white gods? What's going on? Is there a sun that is causing melanin in these gods? What's happening?
And because it's fantasy, it can be extraordinarily frustrating as a creator as well, if you're dealing with somebody else's, because you have to work your way through what someone else's IP allows. But that's what our job was, and I've quite enjoyed wending my way through those.
And Smiling Tom says, so the challenge seems to be in managing to develop new sources of conflict, not rooted in familiar sources, which is clearly a more complex and difficult intellectual exercise. And Aster put this up, I think, in answer to the maddening sexist. I say this as a woman, I like that sort of stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, there was sexism in one of the worlds that I played Wifrip in with Andy Law. My character became an Ulrican priestess. There were no other female priestesses. And that was a fight, but it was a fight that I engaged with on my own terms. Andy didn't say to me, no, there's never been a priestess before, so you can't be one. He said, you did something great for Ulrich. Ulrich blessed you. You're a priestess now. It's going to be hard, though. And I said, fine, I'm willing to accept that. But if I had said to him, I'm not comfortable with that, then that would have been an out-of-character discussion about my past and my experiences in a male-dominated world. And we would have had that openly, and that would have been a good discussion to have, I think.
That is also a really good example of like that very specific, the Ulrican priestess is a really good example of that's not how it works in this setting, because you have a situation where it not being how it works is the view of some people in the setting. You can start to ask, why weren't there Ulrich and priestesses? Was it because Ulrich didn't bless women? Evidently not, because Ulrich just blessed a woman. Is it because the priesthood of Ulrich really liked being a patriarchy and they didn't want women to have that same kind of power? Yeah, probably. So then you can start to have those conversations of like, is it messed up to enforce that patriarchy? Yes. But you can have those conversations from a baseline of, you know, a mutual respect going into it, knowing that it's not entrenched in the setting just because.
Yeah, and I think as a creator, it's really important to do. I felt comfortable having those discussions about Warhammer in Warhammer when I was, you know, working on it, because my lived experience is as, you know, a chair of gender networks. I've worked for women's equality in the workplace. It was really interesting to me to explore that with the writers I was working with. What I wouldn't have felt comfortable with is doing the same for race and ethnicity, which is not my lived experience. And so in those cases, I wouldn't have wanted to inject that into the setting in an uninformed and ignorant way. I would have wanted to have a discussion with you, B, about your experience as, you know, a person who's come into a land that doesn't necessarily all look like you in terms of the dominant structure. And your experience, you know, we talked about your experience traveling around Europe and that feeling of coming home in parts of the world that you didn't necessarily expect to feel like home. And that is a fascinating discussion, but you can only have those discussions if you bring those people into the conversation that don't have the same experience as you.
Right.
I'd like to add one little extra on Istra. Was it Istra's point? And I think that, was it Istra was a she, I think she said. I think that I agree with you, actually, that sometimes including all of these horrible things are super important, because then they can be discussed. And to ignore them and to try and pretend that everything is something else is sometimes just and just not fun. One thing that particularly bugs me is equality in everything is super important, and representation is super important. But if you make representation everyone being white but with a different color of skin, that's not representation. That's just different people appearing and still doing the same white shit. And that's something that bugs me. So it would be better to actually have the conversations, the difficult ones perhaps, around those certain subjects. And I agree with you that those things can make words far more rich, vibrant, realistic if you prefer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be there, and nor does it mean that we have to use the same baseline that we use in the real world. We can have completely different types of bigotry or types of isms, so to speak, that we can bring to the fore, and we can use them to perhaps discuss them in a fashion that isn't difficult, because it's not something that's part of your lived experience. Because if you're directly dealing with something that's part of your lived experience, it can really make you uncomfortable. Where if you're dealing something that's a fantasy version that has an ism attached to it, that's attached to that fantasy, it can be an easier process, and it can also enlighten you, make you realize that perhaps some of the views that you had were wrong. And that's one of the powers of roleplay, because you're actually the character. You're not just reading about someone else's opinions.
You seem to have struck a chord with Istra there.
I agree.
It's nuanced.
I'd like to introduce a question at this point, a thought that's occurred to me, and that is, there's a line, I think, between perpetuating, unhelpful and destructive stereotypes and being like really, really inside the box, and also the other side of that line. I would call it maybe honoring the struggle. Because throughout history, history has been made by people who didn't conform, either didn't, wouldn't, or couldn't. It's the only thing that moves things on. And I'm not really in a position to empathize truly, but I can see a point where being able to live out a struggle within a game and emerge victorious and solve something would be quite empowering. And quite a positive thing that a game could do. And as I say, I'm pretty ignorant on these things, but that was just a thought I had, and I'd love to see what people think of it.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No,
Lindsay.
please, Ben. Sorry,
Thanks.
Dean.
Ben's fine
Old
as well.
habits.
No, both are fine. Absolutely. And I think that comes down to as well, if you are not speaking from own your own intersections and your own lived experiences, that's fine too. It's just when you are speaking about someone or speaking as someone, which is the important distinction, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you can honor those legacies and those struggles when speaking about people in terms of fantasy gaming. Like a really good example would be, injecting the same themes of like Alan Turing's struggle with homosexuality in in the period of time that he was being homosexual in. Even someone who is queer, I can't quite write that same experience, but I can empathize in some ways, and I can sort of view that struggle through things that I do understand and then reflect on that in my work. But everyone can do that because ultimately we are all humans. So there has to be something that you can come down to, even if it's just, I am a human, he was a human, that was really messed up what happened to him, this is what happened, and we can frame it in that way, instead of having to try and speak from that voice, which is I think the misstep that a lot of writers make. They want people to empathize with them, so they try and put them in those shoes, and that can become very murky very quickly.
Here's one for you, Bee, directly. Martin asked, I enjoyed reading Bee's blog posts on other Warhammer cultures, reinventing species, but especially gender and sexuality, but then the blog stopped. Did life get too busy? Or, I fear, pushback quelled your enthusiasm for freely expressing how your Warhammer world would be? Or was it something else?
So this is in reference to, I wrote a blog at the sort of starting the beginning of the pandemic last year, after I had left C7, and I wrote it for about 6-7 months, called Liber, etc. And it did not stop because of pushback. Actually, overwhelmingly, the reception was really positive. Most people were, super on board with it. Thank you very much. Sorry, it's just been telling everyone the elves are Greek since I know exactly the post you're referring to, and that remains one of the funniest things that I've ever written. So I'm very happy that struck a chord. Most of the reception to that was actually really positive. There were a couple of people who were, justifiably pushing back about some things, and I sort of disagreed with their positions, but that was fine. We're allowed to disagree with each other. There are other people who are just assholes about it, but there are going to be people who are assholes about everything. So
that's the truth.
Sad but true.
Exactly. And thick skin. I've been doing this since I was born, and I'm very recently 30. So thick skin at this point.
Happy recently birthday.
Thank you. The reason I stopped writing it was sort of twofold. One, the pandemic was getting more intense, and I started retraining. I started studying clinical psychology, and that just soaked up the vast majority of my time. The other thing is I started writing my own setting that sort of grew out of some of those notes and some of that philosophy that I was writing that blog in originally. And that setting, Alla Antica, has sort of taken a lot of my creative writing focus since. And I have used several of those ideas, expanded on them as well, sort of stripped them back from clarifying those base assumptions that I was doing in Labor, etc. But yeah, it stopped being a project that I cared about because I realized that I was funneling my efforts into the wrong creative thing. Yeah.
So Valistari says, I also have two players who were happily mind blown when I told them that in this wonderful dystopia, being not straight isn't illegal.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever played a not straight character, which, like, Andy and I have the what would it be called? Straight passing privilege, but I'm not straight. And so it's really important to me to be able to express that in a way that sometimes is hidden in my life, and that's important for me because I think it's important for the young people in my life and the people who don't have the privilege of being straight passing to know that there are allies out there, even though sometimes we're hidden. I try not to be hidden. Here is the link. I hope this is the link to the blog.
Yeah, that's to the sexuality and gender part 1. I still haven't written part 2. Maybe this will be the kick up the bum. It has been, goodness me, 19 months.
Wow. And Valistari says, then someone asked me about Rookery romance. Don't even get me started on Rookery romance and the true meaning of evil. It's not worth it. And Creative Fossey says, thank you so much for answering my question earlier on. And also thank you, Roderick Hamilton, for your suggestion on reading Stealing Cthulhu. Oh boy, what a lovely community this really is. I just had to bring that up because I thought it was so sweet. I actually found, I don't know, did anyone else watch Lovecraft Country?
Yes.
Not yet. No.
Yeah, it was really interesting for me because the true horror of that was not Cthulhu. For me, the true horror of that was realizing how little I knew about that really true experience of people in a segregated US, and that it was quite shocking because I didn't know anything about it when I started watching it. So I thought it was just about Cthulhu, and it would be, I'm not a big horror fan, and I thought that would be the horror, and that wasn't the horror of that show. So I would definitely recommend that to people. Right, let me go and find the next question. Kilishandra has asked, do you think it is worth rehabilitating old settings that built firmly inside the box, or would you rather start anew? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want me to
yeah,
go
please
off
go for
this
it.
one? Yeah. So yes, I do think it is. It's sort of, going off what I just said. So it's a nice follow-on. I do think it is worth rehabilitating old settings, especially older settings that have a kernel of something in there that you love. Going back to the point of we shouldn't be making our settings always rosy and everything lovely. We should be including those darker themes as well. One of the things that drew me to Warhammer as a child was seeing characters who did look a little bit like me, and seeing characters who experienced things that were messed up, but they were still powerful despite that. And still, able to navigate the world, even though the world is very difficult and everyone struggles to navigate it. There was still room there. So, despite the racism built into Warhammer, and even kind of because of the racism built into Warhammer, it was very meaningful to me, and still is. So rehabilitating those parts, rewriting those parts as part of Labor, etc., as part of my work with C7, all of those things were labors of love that I did because because I love the setting, and I want to see it grow and fix some of those things, and acknowledge some of the harm that it has perpetuated, and allow that acknowledgement to flourish and help other people. Talking about how Warhammer has had missteps means that we can, dodge that in the future. It also means that we can see ourselves grow, and we can see the setting grow, and we can get an idea of how to make it better in the future, in the real world, in the setting, in new settings. That all being said, obviously, I did start a new setting from those writings, and I also find a lot of value in that. So it really comes down to what your goal is. Both are equally valid, and both are really important. It's just sort of, do you want to be working in a framework that already has some preconceptions, or do you want to start again and try and scrub away all of those preconceptions?
Yes.
Yes, both, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's little I can say on top of that beyond I agree with B. Is it worth rehabilitating old settings? I absolutely think so.
Yes,
and as we've mentioned before, Warhammer is definitely a touchstone for everybody that's on this panel. We've all worked on it, and one of my goals when I have written everything I've written has to be to try and do better. And did I always succeed? No. Did I do some good? I hope so. I tried. I worked hard to try and make sure that not all of our stories were the same old stories that were told before about the same old people. Now, that wasn't always successful, and it didn't always work in the end, but we really tried, and I feel like it was worth it. And for the very reason that B suggests, and that's that I love the setting.
Yeah.
And I want it to be the best that it possibly can be. And sometimes when I look at it, I just shake my head with that's just not cool.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness,
really
that bit's not
interested-
cool.
At the risk of being an apologist, I wasn't there at the very beginning of Warhammer, but I, came when it was about 4 years old when I came on. A lot of it that goes back to the original battle game, like the nationalist stereotypes and it sounds like it was written by a Brexiteer. That was Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell kind of trying to send up those attitudes, trying to satirize them. But unfortunately, along the way, they got kind of fossilized, and that element of satire and silliness was lost.
Yeah, and I did want to hear about your perspective on that, Graham, because when you were first writing for Warhammer, you were pretty liberal, pretty rebellious.
We thought we were,
Exactly.
for the 80s, and
and I'm kind of interested to hear, how did you then, in every time you came back to Wifra, how did that change for you? How did you manifest your own sensibilities to kind of pull it up to date a bit? Was that a challenge for you? Did you find it easy?
Well, I have to admit to a certain amount of complacency on that score, perhaps even to intellectual laziness, because when I came back to the subsequent editions, I did kind of think, oh, well, it's Warhammer. I know what this is about. I'll just write this, this, and this. And I didn't really do the amount of self-examination that I perhaps should have done, just for that very reason.
But in many respects, that's what I was there for.
You certainly made a huge difference.
I mean, I'll give a single example of that. Something that didn't make it through to the Enemy Within, but is worth talking about, because I'd moved away from the project by then, so it never occurred, was I was very strongly behind taking some of the characters that were existing but not important to the Warhammer lore in general, so you wouldn't be tackling anything that the battle game would be concerned about, so thus the Games Workshop as a whole would be bothered about, and looking at those characters and saying, what can we do to these to not only bring them up to date, which sounds really twee, but to look at them and make them better. A single example of that being that I was never a very strong fan of the representation of Katerina Todbringer, because she was presented as a stupid, dumb girl that hung around doing silly things. And one of my key differences that I was intending on putting in was to make her quite literally the power behind the throne. And the reason that they had all the problems with her and she wasn't married was because she was 100% and thoroughly homosexual. And there was an awful lot of issues that had occurred from that and arisen from that. And the implications that that had on a massively, heavily patriarchal society that focused around the Ulricans, and the difficulties that they had with that, and her being just so much more than they were. Because she had a host of advantages they didn't have. And there was a whole lot of writing around that.
That was a great conversation we had.
And Graham and I discussed this, and we had a whole plot line for her, and it was amazeballs.
It was wonderful.
It was amazeballs. But that didn't come to pass for a variety of reasons.
I was about to say I'm having flashbacks to several conversations that we had at around about the same time 2 years ago of you telling me these things. But
yeah, and that was going to be a driving point, and it was also going to be something that the Greater Demon was going to be working against, because it didn't want her around. Because it wanted lots of patriarchal figures in place. It wanted war. It wanted everything to go to war. Its end goal was war. That's what it wanted. And having a figure that represented the alternative was quite important to the storytelling. And she was going to be one of the personifications of that. But that didn't come to pass. But I think it's something that's important to look at when you're looking at, can we look at an existing setting? And can we do something to bring it not just up to date, but to add something that really does bring it to life in a way that was missing perhaps in the past?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I just want to bring this one in. Always worry there are people out there who take the religious fascism of the 40k Imperium a bit too seriously. Surely that's blatant satire, but you can't rely on people seeing that anymore. And that's part of the reason that you do need your settings to move and rehabilitate and change. Because when, like Graham's saying, when the settings were created, they were of their time. They were the satire of the political setup of the time. That's not what we live in now. And so you can't rely on people seeing that satire anymore, because it's not what we live in anymore. And
the reference is lost.
It's not satire
it's no longer satire.
In many ways we live in a time beyond satire.
Quite.
It's like expecting someone now, who was born like one of my kids, to look at Spitting Image and understand any of the jokes. Like, they don't even know who those people are, let alone what the jokes are.
Very true.
Stick a deck chair up your nose.
Exactly.
Like Mag Uruk Thraka.
Indeed.
Indeed.
Oh,
but a lot of the satire has vanished in that.
Jaguski said audio cut out. Which character was that again? It was Katerina Todbringer.
Todbringer. Yeah, absolutely. And I was doing something, the build up for doing something similar with Emmanuel von Leibowitz was in place, that has already been started in Rough Nights and Hard Days. So as a quick conclusion on that one, I would say, is it worth rehabilitating old settings? Absolutely.
Every time.
We love them. We adore them, and we want them to be cool. And it isn't difficult. It just takes a little bit of thought, and not just thought, but care, because this is a setting that everybody loves. So you want to do it in a way that everybody goes, well, that's awesome. That's a cool story. That just really grips me. And that brings everybody with you, rather than doing something which just feels like it's been thrown in and wedged in because everybody feels it should be there. That's not how it should be done. It should be done in a way that makes everybody goes, well, that's just made it awesome.
Exactly.
That's what we're all to do.
Also, like, that self-reflection is really, really important. Like, I don't want to gloss over that point from earlier. Like, Graham, it is actually extremely commendable for you to be able to go, oh, I had that complacency. I was lazy in the past. Like, the fact that you can reflect on that means, like, I'm already keen for what's coming out of the Rookery, and I already know a lot about what's coming out of the Rookery, so of course I'm keen about it. But like, that is really great to hear, because it means that you're thinking about those things. And I mean, again, I already knew that because we have had many of these conversations in the past.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, it's been a time, I think, with a lot of other people, just the realization of how much privilege I have, looking the way I do, feeling the way I do, being essentially the norm against which everybody else is measured by their deviation from the norm, which is me. A horrifying realization indeed. But yeah, I've really, makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think Oxecutor's made a point here that I think is only fair to say that GW very recently did do a very good post stating that 40k is satire. Imperium may be fascist, but the hobby is not. So here we've probably got time for one last question. Kilishandra asked, have you ever had a point when you realized what you were writing was unacceptable and needed to change?
Yes.
Almost every project. The number of times, particularly on Warhammer stuff in the 80s and early 90s, where I would kind of write something, crack up laughing, and then just, that'll never, can't do that.
The hell of a question to end on, Lindsay. Especially considering you, yes.
While you think, B, I've mentioned it before that I wrote something that I thought was really non-binary for Wifrip, the core rulebook, and I passed it by some people who from the trans community, and they were like, "No, it's still binary." And I was like, "I tried."
Yeah.
Oh, disappeared there.
Yeah.
Lindsay's frozen.
Lindsay, you're a little bit frozen.
She does look pretty odd.
Well, I mean, that's the face I get when I think about the gender binary too. But but like from my point of view, there hadn't been too many situations where I was writing something that was unacceptable and needed to change. It was more, I'm choosing my words very carefully here. It was more some of the things that I was told I was not allowed to write, which became unacceptable. And I was like, okay, good to know. Like, yeah.
Yep.
Fair. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I will also say I have been in that situation and I found it particularly difficult. But in terms of writing stuff that, because the question's slightly differently phrased, that's unacceptable and needed to change, I have frequently written things that I thought were fine, and I have sent them out and had them come back from people that have told me that they weren't. And sometimes I've pushed back because that's naturally what you sometimes do. You get defensive. But normally my first inclination is always to say, okay, fair enough. I'll push back as much as it requires so I understand why, okay, oops. I have done that. And my work has been better for it every single time.
Yeah.
And I will add and reinforce B's comment regarding material that I have been sent in that was acceptable, that was deemed to be unacceptable, and that is always difficult.
I just like a last little anecdote. I think would be a fun thing to end on. When I started at C7, I was not out as either bi or non-binary. But me and Andy had some conversations where, like, I think Andy, you knew I was in some fashion queer, but like we hadn't really defined it.
Yeah.
And I remember sending in the first draft of Heart of Glass, and you read it, and Heart of Glass was once significantly more explicitly queer than it ended up being. And I remember you sending back a note, like it was a comment at one particular thing, and we're like, is this going to be okay? Is it all right to have the queer character be a villain? And I was like, I think it'll be okay. I have a feeling it'll be okay.
Yeah, I remember that note.
That was a good day. Very funny. But yeah, like I think every writer goes through situations where, you know, you have to write things that kind of suck, or you get back notes that kind of suck. And you just have to sort of figure out where your line is, and where you're like willing to push back and where you're willing to retreat. And yeah.
Do you know, so thank you so much for all of your honesty today, and for joining us in the chat, and all the comments that have come in the chat that have been really, I don't know, questioning.
Oh,
and she's gone again.
well,
no.
she just, that's yeah, thanks very much for all those things she was going to say.
Oh, well, yeah.
So, given that we apparently have no hostess anymore, I suppose I shall say thank you very much, Bee, for your open honesty, and all those other things that Lindsay was going to say that were super deep, super insightful, and significantly better than anything that I'm coming up with. As always, it is a joy to be talking with you, and as always, it's very amusing to look over to the other side and see Lindsay's face frozen. And I hope that we can talk again more, because as we discussed many times in the past, doing the streams online and just chin wagging about the stuff that we love is always great. She's obviously frozen herself out. So with that, I shall offer a quick thanks to everybody for turning up this week. And I'm going to reach over and do the whole, I suppose I'm going to try and finish the show now, because Lindsay's gone. So excuse me while I go. How do I do this? Do you want to come through?
Hi.
Oh, there we go.
There she is.
What a way to end the show.
And it's Andy Leask.
I'm ready with the button, man. That's what I'm here for.
Go, Andy.
Hello. Goodbye.
Go on, end
Cue
the
the button.
show.
Yeah. Bye.